The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore portrait studio, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Edmund Whitmore adjusted his camera with practiced precision, the brass fittings gleaming in the October afternoon sun. Before him stood two brothers, Thomas and William Hartwell, aged 14 and 16 respectively, their faces bearing the solemn expression expected of proper Victorian portraiture. "Hold still now, lads," Edmund instructed, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had captured hundreds of families in his 20 years behind the camera. "This exposure will take nearly 30 seconds. Thomas, the younger brother, shifted slightly on his feet, his dark hair neatly combed and parted. His Sunday clothes, a crisp white shirt beneath a dark wool vest, felt stiff against his small frame. Beside him, William stood with the confidence of his additional years, his hand resting formally on the marble-topped table that served as the studio's centerpiece. Neither boy spoke, understanding the gravity of having their likenesses preserved for posterity. Edmund ducked beneath the black cloth draped over his camera, studying the inverted image on the ground glass. The composition pleased him, two brothers united in time, their youth captured in silver and light. He slid the glass plate holder into position and removed the dark slide with a practiced motion. "Ready, gentlemen," he announced, his finger poised over the brass shutter release. "Remember, no movement whatsoever." The shutter clicked open with a soft, mechanical whisper. Time seemed suspended in the studio as the silver halides on the glass plate began their invisible dance with light, recording every detail of the scene before them. Thomas's eyes, bright with the curiosity of youth, stared directly into the lens. William's gaze held a more serious quality, as if he understood something his younger brother did not. When the exposure ended, Edmund carefully replaced the dark slide and removed the plate holder. "Excellent work, boys," he said, making a brief notation in his leather-bound ledger. "October 15th, 1877. Hartwell brothers, Thomas, 14, and William, 16, standard portrait, marble table composition." The brothers paid their fee and departed, their footsteps echoing down the wooden staircase that led to Main Street. Edmund stored the exposed plate with the others awaiting development, thinking nothing more of the routine session. He had photographed countless children and families, each plate a moment frozen in time, unchanging and permanent. 3 days later, Edmund descended into his darkroom, the familiar smell of chemicals greeting him like an old friend. The red safety lamp cast an eerie glow over the development trays as he began the meticulous process of bringing the latent images to life. One by one, the plates revealed their secrets: family portraits, individual studies, the occasional wedding photograph. When he lifted the Hartwell brothers' plate from the developer solution, Edmund paused. Something was wrong. Thomas, the younger boy, appeared different. The face, staring back from the glass, showed subtle but unmistakable signs of aging. The smooth skin of youth had developed faint lines around the eyes, and his hair seemed lighter, touched with premature gray at the temples. Edmund held the plate closer to the lamp, his experienced eye scanning for technical flaws. Double exposures, chemical contamination, light leaks, all possibilities raced through his mind. But the image was crisp and clear, with no signs of the common problems that plagued photographers of the era. "Impossible," he muttered, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the plate under a magnifying glass. The aging was subtle, but undeniable. Thomas now appeared to be the older brother, his 14-year-old face bearing the weight of decades. Convinced he had made an error in the development process, Edmund prepared a fresh batch of chemicals. Perhaps the developer had been contaminated, or the timing had been incorrect. Such mistakes, while rare, were not unheard of in his profession. He would develop the plate again, properly this time. But when the image emerged from the second development, Edmund's heart began to race. The aging had progressed further. Thomas's face now showed deeper lines, more pronounced graying, and eyes that held a weariness far beyond his years. The boy, who had stood before his camera just days ago, had been transformed into someone approaching middle age. Edmund's rational mind rejected what his eyes were telling him. Photography was a science, governed by laws as immutable as those that controlled the movement of the planets. Light struck silver salts, creating a permanent record of a moment in time. That record could not change, could not age, could not transform after the fact. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything he understood about his craft. With shaking hands, Edmund developed the plate a third time, then a fourth. Each time, the impossible aging progressed. By the fourth development, Thomas appeared as an elderly man, his face deeply lined, his hair completely gray, his eyes holding the profound sadness of someone who had lived through decades of sorrow and loss. Edmund stumbled backward from the development tray, his mind reeling. The original plate, when examined under the strongest magnification his equipment could provide, showed no signs of tampering, no evidence of double exposure or chemical manipulation. The image was genuine, captured by his own camera, developed by his own hands. As he stood in the red-lit darkness of his studio, surrounded by the tools of his trade that had served him faithfully for 2 decades, Edmund Whitmore realized he was confronting something that transcended the boundaries of science and reason. The photograph before him was not merely a record of the past, it was somehow alive, changing, aging as if time itself had been captured and compressed within the silver emulsion. He wiped the perspiration from his forehead with a trembling hand, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to the empty darkroom. "What you're about to hear challenges everything we thought we knew about the permanence of captured time." Edmund Whitmore pressed his eye against the brass loop, studying the glass plate negative with the intensity of a surgeon examining a wound. The wet, collodion emulsion gleamed under the gaslight of his cramped darkroom, casting amber shadows across the walls lined with chemical bottles and developing trays. October's chill had seeped through the wooden boards of his studio, making his fingers stiff as he adjusted the focus. Something was wrong with this photograph. Terribly, impossibly wrong. The portrait session had taken place 3 days earlier on October 15, 1877. Whitmore remembered every detail with the precision that had made his reputation in Millhaven's growing photography circles. The Ashford brothers had arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, their wool coats damp from the morning's drizzle. Thomas, the elder at 26, had carried himself with the confident bearing of a successful mill foreman. His younger brother Samuel, barely 18, had fidgeted nervously with his pocket watch throughout the consultation. "We need a portrait for our mother's birthday," Thomas had explained, his voice carrying the slight accent of their Irish heritage. "Something she can display in the parlor with pride." Whitmore had nodded, making careful notations in his leather-bound logbook. Entry 2847. Brothers T. and S. Ashford. Standard portrait, formal dress. Weather, overcast, humidity elevated, 85% estimated. Collodion mixture. Silver nitrate 40 grains. Potassium iodide 24 grains. Distilled water 8 ounces. His meticulous record-keeping had served him well through 12 years of operating the studio, helping him troubleshoot the countless variables that could ruin a photograph. The brothers had posed stiffly before his painted backdrop depicting a gentleman's library, Thomas standing with one hand resting on an ornate chair, while Samuel sat with his legs crossed at the ankles. The exposure had taken nearly 30 seconds, requiring them to remain absolutely motionless while Whitmore's large-format camera captured their likenesses onto the chemically prepared glass plate. Everything had proceeded normally during the session. The wet collodion process demanded split-second timing. The glass plate had to be coated with the light-sensitive emulsion, exposed while still damp, and developed immediately afterward. Whitmore had performed these steps thousands of times, his movements automatic and precise. The chemical bath had hissed gently as he slid the exposed plate into the developer, and within minutes, the ghostly negative image had appeared exactly as expected. But now, studying the developed plate under magnification 3 days later, Whitmore felt his hands begin to tremble. The image showed both brothers clearly, their features sharp and properly exposed. Thomas stood in his appointed position, his hand resting on the chair back, his expression serious and dignified. Samuel sat as directed, his youth evident in the slight nervousness around his eyes. Between them, however, stood a third figure. Whitmore removed the loupe and blinked hard, certain his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He had been working late into the evening, developing plates from the week's sittings, and the gaslight created dancing shadows that could easily confuse a weary mind. But when he looked again through the magnifying lens, the impossible remained stubbornly visible. A tall, gaunt man in outdated clothing stood directly behind the chair where Thomas rested his hand. The figure wore a black coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his face remained partially obscured by what appeared to be shadow, despite the even lighting Whitmore had carefully arranged for the portrait. Most disturbing of all, neither Thomas nor Samuel showed any awareness of the presence behind them. Their expressions remained exactly as Whitmore remembered, formal, slightly stiff, but utterly normal. "This cannot be," Whitmore muttered, setting down the loupe with shaking fingers. He had been alone with the brothers during the entire session. The studio's front door had remained locked, the "sitting in progress" sign clearly displayed. No one else had entered the room, and certainly no one had stood behind that chair during the 30-second exposure. Perhaps the plate had been contaminated during development. Chemical residue from previous photographs sometimes created false images, though nothing this distinct or realistic. Whitmore carefully examined the glass surface for scratches, dust particles, or emulsion defects that might explain the anomaly. The plate appeared perfect in every respect except for the impossible presence captured within it. His scientific mind grasped for rational explanations. Double exposure seemed the most likely culprit. Perhaps he had accidentally used a plate that already contained a partial image. But his inventory system made such errors nearly impossible, and besides, the mysterious figure appeared to occupy the same physical space as the chair and backdrop, suggesting the images had been captured simultaneously. Whitmore lit a second gas lamp and positioned it beside his work table, flooding the darkroom with additional light. The enhanced illumination revealed more disturbing details about the phantom figure. The man's clothing appeared to belong to an earlier era, perhaps 20 or 30 years outdated. His coat featured the high collar and narrow lapels fashionable during the 1840s, and his hair was arranged in the severe side-parting style that had fallen from favor after the war. More unsettling still was the figure's posture. While Thomas and Samuel had maintained the rigid stillness required for proper exposure, the unknown man seemed to be in motion, his body slightly blurred as if he had been walking or turning during the photograph. Yet this motion blur appeared only around his form. The chair, backdrop, and even the brothers themselves remained perfectly sharp. Whitmore reached for his journal, a habit developed over years of documenting unusual photographic phenomena. His pen scratched across the paper as he recorded every observable detail. October 18th, 1877. Anomalous figure present in plate 2847. Subject appears to be adult male, approximately 6 feet in height, wearing dark clothing of outdated fashion. Position: standing behind subject chair during Ashford Brothers portrait. No corresponding person present during actual sitting. Possible explanations: contamination, unlikely; double exposure, implausible; chemical reaction, unknown. As he wrote, a thought struck him that made his blood run cold. What if he developed the plate again? The wet collodion process was permanent, once fixed. The chemical reactions that created the image could not be reversed or altered. But perhaps a second examination under different conditions might reveal the source of the error. Whitmore prepared a fresh batch of developing solution, measuring each chemical with extra care. His hands had steadied now, his scientific curiosity overcoming his initial shock. He would approach this mystery methodically, documenting each step and observation. If there was a rational explanation for the phantom figure, systematic investigation would reveal it. He slipped the glass plate back into the developer and began the familiar routine of gentle agitation and timing. The image emerged gradually from the chemical bath, the brothers' faces appearing first, followed by their clothing and the studio backdrop. And there, materializing with the same inexorable certainty, was the third figure. But something had changed. The mysterious man's position had shifted slightly, his head now turned at a different angle, and his hand, previously hidden within the folds of his coat, now extended toward Thomas's shoulder as if in the act of touching or grasping. Whitmore's scientific objectivity crumbled. He dropped the developing tongs with a clatter that echoed through the small dark room. The plate remained suspended in its chemical bath while he stared in growing horror at what should have been impossible. Photographic plates were fixed documents, as immutable as carved stone. They could not change, could not show different scenes with each development. Yet before his eyes lay evidence that defied every principle of photographic science he had spent 12 years mastering. The phantom figure was not only present but apparently moving between developments, occupying slightly different positions each time the plate was processed. With trembling hands, Whitmore lifted the plate from the developer and held it up to the gaslight. The mysterious man's face, previously obscured by shadow, now showed more clearly. Gaunt cheekbones caught the light, and deep-set eyes seemed to stare directly out from the glass surface. Most chilling of all, those eyes appeared to be looking not at the camera, but at something beyond it, at the photographer himself. Whitmore set the plate aside and fumbled for his logbook, his meticulous handwriting now reduced to barely legible scrawls as he documented this second development. Second processing reveals positional changes in anomalous figure. Movement impossible according to established photographic principles. Facial features now visible. Expression suggests awareness of observer. The implications crashed over him like a cold wave. If the figure could move between developments, if it showed awareness of being observed, then this was no mere chemical anomaly or double exposure. Something far more disturbing was at work, something that challenged not just photographic science but the very nature of reality itself. He would need to develop the plate again. Scientific method demanded repeated observation and documentation, regardless of personal comfort. But as Whitmore prepared his chemicals for a third attempt, he couldn't shake the feeling that each development was somehow drawing the phantom figure closer to emergence from its glass prison. Outside his dark room, Milhaven slept peacefully under October's cloudy sky, unaware that in a cramped studio above the millinery shop, a photographer was discovering that some mysteries refused to stay buried in the past. As Whitmore positioned the plate for its third journey through the developer, he whispered a prayer that whatever emerged from the chemical bath would finally provide answers rather than deeper questions. The solution rippled gently as he lowered the glass plate into its depths, beginning another impossible transformation. Each development revealed changes that defied every known principle of photographic science. The bell above Whitmore's studio door chimed with an urgency that seemed to echo through the narrow confines of Beacon Street. Mrs. Dorothy Ashford swept through the entrance like a storm cloud, her black silk dress rustling with each determined step. Behind her trailed two young men, though one appeared far older than his years should have allowed. The afternoon light filtering through the studio's grimy windows cast long shadows across their faces, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and disbelief. "Mr. Whitmore." Mrs. Ashford's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and demanding. The photographer emerged from his darkroom, wiping chemical stains from his hands with a stained cloth. His weathered face showed no surprise at her arrival, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, perhaps fear, perhaps guilt. "Mrs. Ashford, I trust the portraits are to your satisfaction," Whitmore began, but his words were immediately silenced by the fury in her eyes. Satisfaction, she spat, her gloved hands trembling as she withdrew the photographs from her leather satchel. Look at this abomination. This cannot be my Timothy. She thrust the portrait forward, her voice rising with each word. The photograph showed a man of considerable age, his face lined with wrinkles that spoke of decades lived, his hair thinned and graying at the temples. Yet the eyes remained unmistakably those of young Timothy Ashford. Timothy himself stood behind his mother, his actual 14-year-old frame dwarfed by the presence captured in the image. His face had gone pale, his hands shaking as he stared at the photograph that bore his name but showed a stranger's aged features. Charles, his 16-year-old brother, appeared exactly as he should in his portrait, youthful, innocent, untouched by whatever dark force had afflicted his sibling's image. There has been no error, madam, Whitmore replied, his voice steady despite the accusation in her tone. He moved to a tall cabinet and withdrew a glass plate, handling it with the reverence of a priest holding sacred relics. This is the original negative of your son's portrait. The image you see is precisely what was captured by my camera. Mrs. Ashford's eyes narrowed as she examined the plate, holding it up to catch the light streaming through the window. The negative showed the same impossible truth, her young son transformed into a middle-aged man, captured in silver and shadow on the glass surface. Her breathing became shallow, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. "This is impossible," she whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. Deep in her heart, she knew she was witnessing something beyond the realm of natural explanation. Develop another print. Now, I must see this process with my own eyes. Whitmore nodded gravely, understanding that only demonstration would convince her. Very well, please follow me to the darkroom. But I warn you, Mrs. Ashford, what you are about to witness may disturb you greatly. The darkroom was a cramped space filled with the acrid smell of developing chemicals. Red light bathed everything in an otherworldly glow, making their faces appear ghostly and strange. Mrs. Ashford watched with growing horror as Whitmore placed the glass plate into the enlarger and began the development process. The paper was inserted into the chemical bath, and slowly, gradually, an image began to emerge from the blank surface. But this image was different from the first. As the photograph developed before their eyes, Timothy's face appeared older still. Where the first print had shown a man of perhaps 45, this new image revealed features that belonged to someone well past 50. Deep lines carved canyons across his forehead, his hair had receded further, and his eyes held a weariness that seemed to span decades. The transformation was impossible to deny, impossible to explain, and absolutely terrifying to witness. Mrs. Ashford's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream that threatened to escape. Timothy stumbled backward, his young face a mirror of shock and confusion. Charles gripped his brother's shoulder, his own features pale with fear. "How?" Mrs. Ashford managed to gasp, her voice barely above a whisper. "How is this possible?" Whitmore carefully lifted the photograph from the chemical bath with metal tongs, his movements deliberate and practiced despite the supernatural horror unfolding before them. "I wish I could provide you with an answer, Mrs. Ashford. This phenomenon began several weeks ago, though I confess I do not understand its nature or origin." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Ashford stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. Her son, her 14-year-old boy, was aging before her eyes through the medium of Whitmore's camera. Each development brought forth more years, more decay, more evidence of time's cruel passage compressed into impossible moments. "We are leaving," she declared suddenly, her voice regaining its strength through sheer force of maternal will. She snatched both photographs from Whitmore's hands and clutched them to her chest like evidence of a crime. "Timothy, Charles, we are departing this cursed place immediately." She turned to face Whitmore directly, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. The red light of the darkroom cast diabolic shadows across her features, transforming her into an avenging angel confronting forces beyond mortal comprehension. "This studio is damned," she proclaimed, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "My sons will never again set foot on Beacon Street. Whatever devil's work you practice here, it will not claim my children." Timothy reached for his mother's arm, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Mother, I don't understand what's happening to me." Mrs. Ashford pulled her son close, her protective instincts overwhelming her fear. She could feel his youthful frame trembling against her, so different from the aged figure captured in the photographs. The contrast was heartbreaking. Her child, still innocent and young, yet somehow connected to these images of premature decay. "We will speak of this no more," she told him firmly, though her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. "Whatever sorcery has touched these photographs will not follow us home." But even as she spoke these words, she knew they carried little comfort. The photographs in her hands were proof of something beyond natural law, something that had already touched her family in ways she could not comprehend. The images seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the aged Timothy trapped within the silver and paper was trying to communicate across an impossible divide. Whitmore watched them prepare to leave, his face etched with lines of genuine concern. "Mrs. Ashford, perhaps if we could study this phenomenon further, we might find a way to—" "No," she cut him off sharply. "There will be no further study, no additional experiments. You have done quite enough damage already." She ushered her sons toward the darkroom door, desperate to escape the red-tinged chamber where she had witnessed the impossible. The chemical smell seemed to cling to their clothes, marking them as witnesses to something unholy. As they emerged into the main studio, the natural light felt like a blessing after the hellish atmosphere of the darkroom. But the photographs remained in Mrs. Ashford's possession, tangible proof that their nightmare was far from over. "Come, boys," she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "We are leaving this place behind us forever." Timothy cast one last glance at Whitmore's camera, the innocent-looking device that had somehow captured his future decay. Charles pulled his brother toward the door, understanding that their family had been forever changed by whatever dark forces lurked within the studio's walls. Mrs. Ashford paused at the threshold, turning back to deliver her final judgment upon the photographer and his cursed establishment. Her words came slowly, deliberately, each syllable weighted with the horror of what she had witnessed. The afternoon sun streamed through the studio windows, but it could not dispel the darkness that had settled over their lives. "I watched my boy's youth drain away before my eyes, like water from a cracked vessel." Dr. Cornelius Marsh adjusted his spectacles and leaned closer to the mahogany examination table where the mysterious photograph lay beneath the focused beam of his laboratory's gas lamp. The plate gleamed with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse with each flicker of the flame above. November 3, 1877, marked the beginning of what would become the most perplexing investigation of his distinguished career at Millhaven Technical Institute. The precision micrometer trembled slightly in his weathered hands as he positioned it over the photographic surface. Each measurement he recorded defied logical explanation. The facial features of young Timothy Ashford showed progressive alterations that spoke of decades of natural aging, creases around the eyes that deepened with mathematical precision, a jawline that had sharpened and defined itself, hair that had receded in patterns consistent with advanced years. Yet the boy himself remained frozen in time at 14 years of age. "Impossible," Marsh muttered, his breath fogging the lens of his examination device. "The emulsion shows no signs of chemical degradation whatsoever." He made careful notations in his leather-bound journal, each stroke of his pen accompanied by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The photographic plate maintained its chemical stability despite the supernatural transformations occurring within its silver halide matrix. 3 days of sleepless analysis later, the sound of iron wheels against cobblestone announced the arrival of Professor Helena Blackwood from the Boston Institute of Photographic Arts. Her reputation preceded her like a storm front, brilliant, uncompromising, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to uncover photographic fraud. She swept into Marsh's laboratory with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to solving the unsolvable. "Professor Marsh," she greeted him with a curt nod, her steel-gray hair pulled back severely beneath a practical woolen hat. "I've traveled through considerable inconvenience to examine this anomaly. I trust it will prove worthy of my time." Blackwood's spectroscopic analysis began immediately, her instruments casting rainbow fragments across the laboratory walls as she dissected the photograph's very essence. Hours passed in concentrated silence, broken only by the occasional scratch of her pen or the soft click of her apparatus being adjusted. When she finally looked up from her work, her expression had transformed from professional skepticism to genuine bewilderment. "The silver halide crystals," she announced, her voice carrying an unusual tremor, "are arranged in patterns I can only describe as temporally inconsistent. It's as if time itself has become entangled within the photographic medium." She gestured toward her notes with hands that shook imperceptibly. According to every law of photographic science, this should be impossible. The mystery deepened further when Dr. Samuel Reeves arrived from Millhaven General Hospital on November 8th. A man of considerable medical experience, he had agreed to examine both Ashford boys to resolve the growing contradiction between the photograph's implications and physical reality. His examination room filled with the antiseptic scent of carbolic acid as he conducted his thorough assessment. Timothy Ashford sat perfectly still on the examination table, his youthful features unmarked by time's passage. Reeves measured his height, examined his teeth for signs of development, and tested his reflexes with methodical precision. Every indicator confirmed what his eyes already told him. The boy remained physically 14 years old, showing no signs of premature aging or any condition that might explain the photograph's supernatural behavior. "Your pulse is strong and steady," Reeves informed Timothy, his stethoscope cold against the boy's chest. "Your development is entirely consistent with your chronological age." He made careful notations, each measurement serving to deepen the paradox rather than resolve it. The physician's younger brother, Marcus Ashford, displayed similar results. Both boys appeared to exist in perfect physical stasis while their photographic counterparts continued their inexorable march through accelerated time. The contradiction gnawed at Reeves's scientific sensibilities like a persistent fever. As November's chill deepened and the investigation's scope expanded, whispers began circulating through Millhaven's academic circles. The photograph had become more than a curiosity. It represented a challenge to the fundamental laws of nature itself. Each expert who examined it left more puzzled than when they arrived, their certainties crumbling like autumn leaves beneath the weight of inexplicable evidence. The decision to attempt a seventh development came after days of heated debate among the assembled scientists. Marsh argued for caution, his instincts warning him that they were approaching dangerous territory. Blackwood insisted that only through continued observation could they hope to understand the mechanism behind the anomaly. Reeves, driven by medical curiosity, believed that documenting the progression might reveal patterns that could be scientifically analyzed. The development chamber had been prepared with meticulous care, every chemical measured to exact specifications. The three scientists gathered around the processing tray as the image began to emerge from the photographic solution, like a ghost materializing from morning mist. What they witnessed would haunt them for the remainder of their careers. The image that emerged showed Timothy Ashford as he might appear in death, gaunt, hollow-eyed, ancient beyond measure. The mercury vapor theory emerged first, presented by Dr. Edwin Hartwell from the Massachusetts Institute of Chemistry, with the confidence of a man who had spent decades explaining away mysteries. He stood in the cramped studio, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the afternoon light as he gestured toward the hat factory's towering smokestack visible through the grimy window. "The explanation is quite rational, gentlemen," Dr. Hartwell announced, his voice carrying the authority of scientific certainty. "Mercury vapor from the nearby hat factory has been contaminating the atmospheric conditions in this studio. The vapors interact with the silver emulsion on the photographic plates, causing premature aging effects in the chemical composition." Samuel Whitmore watched from the corner, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, while Timothy sat hunched on a wooden stool, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. The boy had grown quieter since the photograph, speaking only when directly addressed, his gaze often drifting to some invisible point beyond the walls. Dr. Hartwell produced a leather portfolio filled with documented cases. "I have similar aging effects reported at 2 other photographic studios," he continued, spreading the papers across Whitmore's cluttered workbench. "Both were located downwind of industrial sites, one near a chemical plant in Connecticut, another adjacent to a metalworking facility in Rhode Island. The pattern is unmistakable. The evidence seemed compelling. Charts showed wind patterns carrying industrial emissions directly toward the studio. Chemical analyses of air samples revealed mercury concentrations well above normal levels. Even the timing aligned perfectly. The hat factory had increased production 3 months before the first anomalous photograph appeared. Yet, when Dr. Hartwell attempted to replicate the phenomenon under controlled conditions, using identical chemicals and carefully maintained atmospheric conditions in his Boston laboratory, nothing happened. The test plates developed normally, showing no signs of the mysterious aging effect that had plagued Whitmore's studio. "Perhaps a specific combination of humidity and temperature," Dr. Hartwell muttered, adjusting his spectacles as he studied the failed experiments. But even his scientific certainty began to waver as test after test yielded ordinary results. While Dr. Hartwell struggled with his theories, Detective Inspector Morris Hayes arrived from Boston with an altogether different explanation. A tall, lean man with sharp features and calculating eyes, Hayes had built his reputation on exposing elaborate frauds and confidence schemes. "Deliberate deception," Hayes declared bluntly during his first examination of the studio. "Mr. Whitmore, your mounting debts are a matter of public record. The sensational publicity from these photographs would certainly benefit a struggling photographer, wouldn't it?" Hayes methodically documented Whitmore's financial troubles: overdue rent, unpaid suppliers, a dwindling clientele. He theorized that Whitmore had prepared multiple plates in advance, using chemical treatments to create the aging effects, then switched them through sleight of hand during the development process. "The technique is not uncommon among stage magicians," Hayes explained, demonstrating how prepared plates could be concealed and substituted. "A moment's distraction, a practiced movement, and the audience sees what they expect to see: magic where none exists." The detective's theory gained credence when he discovered correspondence between Whitmore and several newspaper editors, letters that suggested the photographer had been seeking ways to generate publicity for his failing business. Hayes even found evidence of Whitmore researching chemical processes that could artificially age photographic emulsions. But as Hayes delved deeper into his investigation, he encountered an insurmountable obstacle. During each development session, witnesses had maintained continuous observation of both Whitmore and the plates. Mrs. Margaret Chen, the elderly seamstress who served as Timothy's guardian, had never taken her eyes off the process. Dr. Hartwell himself had supervised several developments. Even Hayes's own assistant had monitored a session without detecting any deception. "The continuous presence of witnesses makes such elaborate fraud practically impossible," Hayes admitted reluctantly, his confidence shaken by the weight of testimony. "Unless we're dealing with a conspiracy involving multiple parties, including respected members of the scientific community." As rational explanations crumbled under scrutiny, whispered conversations began to explore more unsettling possibilities. The paranormal theory emerged gradually from the shadows of local folklore, brought forth by elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents had shared. Old Thomas Brennan, whose family had lived in Salem County for 7 generations, arrived at the studio one evening carrying a worn leather journal. His gnarled hands trembled slightly as he opened the ancient book, revealing pages filled with faded ink and careful handwriting. "My great-great-grandfather kept records," Brennan explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Salem County records from the 1690s mention similar anomalies involving reflective surfaces and what they called devil's mirrors." The journal entries described incidents where mirrors and polished metal surfaces had shown images from different times, past events replaying like ghostly echoes, future scenes materializing like prophetic visions. The colonial authorities had investigated these reports with the same mixture of fear and fascination that now gripped those examining Timothy's photograph. One entry, dated October 1692, described a silversmith whose polished surfaces began reflecting scenes of times yet to come and days long past, as if the very fabric of time had torn like old cloth. The silversmith had eventually abandoned his trade, claiming the visions drove him to madness. "Time pockets," Brennan whispered, using the term his ancestors had employed. Places where past and future intersected, where the normal flow of moments became tangled like yarn in a cat's claws. Supporting this otherworldly theory was Timothy's increasingly disturbing behavior. The boy had begun experiencing vivid nightmares that left him screaming in the middle of the night, dreams where he lived as an old man, trapped in a body worn down by decades he had never experienced. "I remember being tired," Timothy told Mrs. Chen one morning, his young face pale and drawn. "So tired that walking hurt, and my hands shook when I tried to hold things. But I'm only 12. How can I remember being old?" These dreams had begun even before the first photograph was taken, suggesting that whatever force was at work had been affecting Timothy long before the camera captured its impossible image. The boy described memories of conversations with people he had never met, of walking through streets that had been demolished years before his birth, of feeling the weight of sorrows that belonged to someone else's lifetime. As the investigation stretched into its 3rd week, each theory seemed to explain some aspects of the phenomenon while leaving others impossibly suspended. The chemical contamination theory accounted for the industrial environment, but failed experimental replication. The fraud hypothesis explained the financial motive but couldn't overcome the witness testimony. The paranormal explanation embraced the historical precedents but offered no mechanism that rational minds could accept. Dr. Hartwell returned to his laboratory, muttering about unknown chemical interactions. Detective Hayes filed reports filled with qualified conclusions and unresolved questions. Old Thomas Brennan retreated to his cottage, clutching his ancestors' journal like a talisman against forces beyond understanding. In the studio, Timothy sat for what everyone hoped would be one final session, his young face bearing an expression of resignation that belonged on someone decades older. The camera waited, its brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon light, ready to capture whatever truth or deception or supernatural mystery would emerge from the developing chemicals. Each theory explained some facts while leaving others impossibly suspended, like light bent through a broken lens. The acrid smell of burning sulfur filled every corner of Whitmore's studio at precisely 3:17 a.m. on November 15th, cutting through the stale air like a blade. The 3 members of the Massachusetts Photographic Society stood in absolute silence, their faces pale in the dim red glow of the developing lamp. Harold Whitmore's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the developer bath, his knuckles white against the metal rim. "Something's wrong," whispered Edmund Hartwell, the eldest of the 3 witnesses, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of chemicals. His weathered fingers clutched his notebook, but the pencil remained motionless, frozen by what was unfolding before them. The photograph emerged slowly from the chemical bath, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. What had once been a clear, sharp portrait of young Timothy Ashford now displayed something that defied all reason. The boy's face, which had appeared normal when first captured on the glass plate, was transforming before their very eyes. Flesh seemed to recede, revealing the stark outline of bone beneath. The innocent smile had vanished, replaced by a hollow, skeletal grimace that bore no resemblance to any living child. "Dear God," breathed Marcus Sheffield, the youngest member of their group, stepping backward until his shoulders pressed against the studio wall. His camera bag slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the cramped space. Whitmore said nothing, his eyes fixed on the developing image with a mixture of fascination and mounting horror. The sulphurous smell grew stronger, making their eyes water and their throats burn. The developer solution, which should have remained clear and stable, began to bubble and foam around the edges of the glass plate, as if the very chemicals were rejecting what they were being asked to reveal. 2 miles away, in a modest house on Elm Street, Timothy Ashford jolted upright in his bed with a scream that pierced the pre-dawn silence. His mother, Sarah, rushed into his room to find her son thrashing against his covers, his eyes wide but unseeing, his voice raw from crying out. No amount of shaking or calling his name could break through whatever nightmare held him captive. "Timothy! Timothy, wake up!" she pleaded, her own voice rising in panic as her husband appeared in the doorway, hastily pulling on his robe. But Timothy remained locked in his terror, his screams echoing through the house for what felt like an eternity. His father checked the clock on the mantel repeatedly, marking each agonizing minute that passed. 17 minutes of pure, inexplicable horror before the boy's eyes finally focused, his breathing gradually slowing to normal as he collapsed back onto his pillow, exhausted and confused. Back in the studio, the impossible was becoming undeniable. The glass plate, despite being handled with utmost care and stored under perfect conditions, began to show hairline fractures spreading across its surface like a spider's web. The cracks appeared spontaneously, without any external pressure or temperature change, radiating outward from the center where Timothy's transformed face stared back at them with hollow, empty sockets. "The plate!" gasped Dr. William Thornton, the third witness, pointing with a shaking finger. "It's breaking apart." The fractures spread with increasing speed, accompanied by tiny pinging sounds as the stress built within the glass. The chemical bath continued to bubble and churn, releasing more of that nauseating sulphurous odor that seemed to cling to their clothes and skin. Whitmore finally moved, reaching for the plate with desperate urgency, but it was too late. With a sharp crack that made all 4 men flinch, the glass plate split completely in half, the 2 pieces floating separately in the now contaminated developer solution. The skeletal image of Timothy Ashford, frozen forever in that nightmarish transformation, was divided down the middle, making any further development impossible. "It's ruined," Whitmore whispered, his voice hollow with defeat and something deeper, relief. "Everything's ruined." The witnesses stood in stunned silence, each man grappling with what they had seen and documented. Their scientific minds struggled to process the impossible, while their human instincts screamed that they had witnessed something that should never have been revealed to mortal eyes. As dawn approached, casting weak gray light through the studio's grimy windows, Whitmore began the methodical process of cleaning up. His movements were mechanical, almost ritualistic, as he disposed of the contaminated chemicals and carefully removed the broken plate fragments. The witnesses helped in silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what they would tell their colleagues, their families, their own consciences. The following morning brought a decision that surprised no one who had been present that terrible night. Whitmore moved through his studio with grim efficiency, sealing bottles, covering equipment, and locking away his notes and experimental materials. Every piece of apparatus was left exactly as he had positioned it, as if he intended to return the next day, though everyone knew he would not. "I'm taking the morning train to Boston," he announced to the small group of townspeople who had gathered outside his studio, drawn by rumors of the previous night's events. His face was haggard, aged by more than the few hours since the experiment had concluded. The studio is closed indefinitely. By noon, Harold Whitmore had disappeared from Millhaven forever, leaving behind only questions and a building that would stand empty for decades to come. The studio remained exactly as he had left it, a testament to one man's journey into territories that perhaps were never meant to be explored. Years passed, and the building gathered dust and legends in equal measure. It wasn't until 1923 that renovators, hired to restore the old structure, discovered Whitmore's equipment still arranged precisely as he had positioned it on that final night. His notes lay open on the workbench, the last entry dated November 15th, describing atmospheric conditions and chemical preparations for what would be his final, catastrophic experiment. The renovators, practical men with no knowledge of photography's darker possibilities, simply documented what they found and stored it all in the building's basement. They had no way of knowing that they were preserving evidence of something that would resurface decades later, when another curious mind would stumble upon the same terrible discovery. Today, the original cracked plate resides in the Millhaven Historical Society, displayed behind protective glass, never again to be developed. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.